Hi, this is Mike Lacona. I've had the privilege of being on the Deeper Waters podcast with Nick Peters several times over the past few years. Nick is one of the finest interviewers on the internet today. He's well-read and asks the type of questions that bring valuable insights for his listeners. So if you want to get great information from top-notch scholars in a concise package, the Deeper Waters podcast with Nick Peters is where you need to be.
You stand on the shore of the ocean watching the tide come in. You sense the call of the sea beckoning to take you further. You step forward little by little, not knowing what to expect, but expecting more. You keep going as the ocean calls you to enter in to deeper waters.
Hello everyone, welcome to the Deeper Waters podcast. I am Nick Peters, your host, seeking to bring you the very best in Christian scholarship and apologetics. And today's show, like all the others we've done, will be no exception. We're going to be talking today about eschatology, study of the end times and such. And we're having a guest on who's been on here twice before as he goes through his series here. He's writing a historical fiction involving the book of Revelation and the destruction of Jerusalem. And that's Brian Godawa. He's the award-winning Hollywood screenwriter to End All Wars, a controversial movie and culture blogger at Godawa.com, an internationally known teacher on faith, worldviews, and storytelling, Hollywood Worldviews, an Amazon best-selling author of biblical fiction, Chronicles of the Nephilim, and provocative theology, God Against the Gods. His obsession with God, movies, and worldviews results in theological storytelling that blows your mind while inspiring your soul. And he's not exaggerating. This series, as I've been reading through it, it really is a very good series. And I say that as someone who really doesn't take the time much to read fiction, but this one is very much worth reading. I did enjoy this third book quite a lot. I was just reading through it at night and just saying, I know I have to get through a show, but I just want to get through it to see what happens. And he's back here with us to discuss it again. And we're going to be talking about end times and anything related to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. So, Brian, welcome back to the Deeper Waters podcast.
It's great to be here, Nick.
Now, well, people who might not know who you are and such, tell us a bit about how you got to be doing what you're doing.
Yeah, well, I have been a screenwriter for a long time now in Hollywood, and I wrote a book as a Christian as well, and I wrote a book called Hollywood Worldviews years ago to help Christians try to appreciate and understand how worldviews are communicated through movies and through storytelling, actually, in particular. And but in the course of that love and interest, involvement in screenwriting and storytelling, I came to the point, about 8 years ago where I started writing novels. And I realized that novels were a great way to be able to tell a good, long, in-depth, deep story, even to the point where I could incorporate a lot of theology that I really love to get into. And a lot of people don't like theology, but I love how you can incorporate it into stories in a way that can come across and be meaningful to people. And so I started about 8 years ago writing Chronicles of the Nephilim, and it became a bestseller. And I subsequently wrote about eight novels in Chronicles of the Nephilim, all of them bestsellers on Amazon, biblical fiction. And it sort of inspired me because I got to the end of this series, and I was basically through that series, I was telling the stories of the Nephilim and the Watchers and bizarre stuff that's in the Bible. And I was retelling them in a way that I wanted to stay true to the Bible, but I also wanted to, sort of fill in the gaps with some imagination and some fiction and make it interesting. And I realized at the end of that series, I ended it with Jesus. And I realized I wasn't done yet because Jesus talked a lot about, if you check in his parables and such, he talked a lot about the coming destruction of the temple. And part of his ministry was he's saying, Jesus was saying, look, I'm Messiah, and he would tell people, you're going to kill me. They're going to kill and reject Messiah, right? And this generation of Jews are going to reject Messiah. And in Matthew 23, he says, because of that, because you're going to kill Messiah, all the blood of all the previous prophets killed in the land of Israel would be upon this generation for killing me, right? And then he said, therefore, God is going to destroy your house. And he also told parables about that as well. I think it's, Matthew 25 and some of these other places where he talks about how, God is like a landlord who has a vineyard, and the Jews are like the tenants, and they end up killing all the prophets. And then eventually God would send his own son, and they killed him. And then he said, what do you think they would do what do you think the tenant or the landlord will do to the tenants? And they said, he will come and destroy their city and burn them down and kill them. And so, of course, that's all a reference to the destruction of Jerusalem. So I was telling that story in the book Jesus Triumphant, the last book of Chronicles of the Nephilim, and I realized I have to tell that story of the destruction of the temple. And then that's what inspired me to begin the series Chronicles of the Apocalypse, which I'm now released my third book called Resistant, Revolt of the Jews. And there's going to be four books total. But what that story is the story of a very important event that some Christians don't really know much about, but we need to learn more because it's so crucial to our history as Christianity, but also to Jewish history, because after the book of Acts, we're all familiar with that, but then we don't, it's sort of like people tend to put the book down after Acts, and then we don't learn much more until maybe, sometimes, the Reformation or something like that, or the Roman Catholic Church history and stuff like that. But there's a time period right after the book of Acts, around, 55, 60 AD till 70 AD, that describe that where this event occurs of the Jewish war. And the Jews were revolting against Rome, and they rose up against Rome, and they were expecting Messiah to come and save them from Rome. Because they also had the prophet Daniel. I mean, they believed the prophet Daniel, and they were expecting Messiah to come soon. But of course, we know that as a whole, they rejected Jesus, right? Except for those who did believe him, right? Anyway, so Rome, Nero, who's Caesar at the time, he sends legions of armies led by Vespasian and his son Titus to go and conquer Judea, Samaria, and ultimately to besiege the city of Jerusalem and destroy it and destroy the temple. And this is an event that changed the history of Christianity and Judaism, because after that point in time, there was no longer a temple. The Jews could no longer perform their obligations to Torah. So they were Vespasian allowed them to sort of the surviving Pharisees and such. He allowed them to start over at the city called Yavne and allow them to sort of revamp their religion, and they came up with the Talmudic religion, which was basically a version of Judaism without having to have a temple, right? And so it changed Judaism to be non-Torah-like, but it also changed Christianity because up until that point, Christianity was still struggling as being sort of still intimately connected with Judaism, even so much so that the main church of the Christians was still in Jerusalem, and of course they had those problems between the Jewish non-believers and the Jewish believers. But that when the city was destroyed, Jesus had told the Christians, look, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, flee to the mountains, because God's going to judge Jerusalem, and you're my people, and I don't want you to be judged. And so we learn from history that that the Christians did flee. They fled to a city called Pella, and then the city was destroyed. And after that point in time, Christianity then exploded to the rest of the world because it was no longer sort of intimately hooked onto Judaism, because that had been transformed and sort of smashed for a while, right? And so that's a very fascinating event. I wanted to tell that story, and I wanted to, and at that same point in time, that was when the Book of Revelation was written. Now, there is scholarly dispute. We don't know exactly when, but I'm convinced that the Book of Revelation was written probably sometime around the year 65 AD or so, in the middle of the Neronic persecution against the Christians. And I wanted to tell the story of I call Apocalypse of the Apocalypse. I call the Chronicles of the Apocalypse the origin story of the book of Revelation, because I tell about how John's writing it in the midst of that Jewish war that was rising up, and the Christians are being persecuted, and all this stuff thrown to the lions, etc. And so that's where my series opens up in the first book, Tyrant. It opens up with the Great Fire of Rome and the persecution of the Christians. And then it goes through, and it's going to lead all the way up to the destruction of the city. And so the third book that I just released a couple months ago, or I'm sorry, just a month ago, Resistant, Revolt of the Jews. And so I'm focusing right now on that war of the Jews when they're fighting against the Romans. The Roman army is going to come. Right now, the Roman army is destroying, the surrounding Judea and Samaria and Idumea and all that. And they're going to ultimately go to the Jerusalem, but that's sort of the third book. They're not all the way there yet. So I'm telling that story on how the Jews are trying to survive and the Christians, what happened to the Christians in that time period. And it's basically written as a epic action adventure, historical action adventure. But I also have another side to the story, and that is the spiritual side. And I think, by necessity, whenever you try to, write about angels and demons, it's a difficult thing to not be, sort of kooky or cliche and such. But I try to show the spiritual side of things, because the book of Revelation talks a lot about, the kind of spiritual warfare that's going on. And so I have that side of the story as well, the supernatural side, the spiritual warfare, because I think that in the Bible, I think there is a strong connection between what is going on in the earthly realm and what is going on in the heavenly realm. So, for instance, there's this biblical view that if there was a battle on earth, between earthly authorities, there were heavenly authorities behind those earthly authorities, and there would also be war in heaven. And that's sort of the picture that you also get in the book of Revelation. So I'm trying to depict those two in a way that would be also, interesting, as well as, as theologically, as biblical as I can make it, And that's sort of the big premise of the whole series. Mm-hmm. But the unique side that you're getting at is, whereas most end times theories these days are very similar to Left Behind, and there's a lot of books out there about, this is what the book of Revelation might look like, in the future, and cloning of Nephilim and alien disclosure and all this, wild science fiction stuff. And I'm actually saying, no, I actually think the book of Revelation was written for the first century mostly, and that I want us to understand, well, how might those people in the first century have read the book of Revelation as they understood it related to themselves? And that's something that's a fresh take that I think really hasn't been done yet. I think it's been done, but not in a successful way that's become popular. Mm-hmm. And so I'm hoping that this will sort of help get that view out in an entertaining way, but also historically true and biblically, consistent.
Yeah, I like what you said about how many Christians don't seem to know about this event, the destruction of Jerusalem, in church history. I grew up reading a lot of comic strips and such, and Peanuts was one of my favorite. And there was one where Charlie Brown comes up to Sally, who's writing something, and see what she's writing, and she's sourcing a paper on church history, and she says, "Our pastor was born on such and such a date." And that's pretty much the way a lot of Christians, I think, do go to church history. They see what happened in Acts, then they might jump to the Reformation, and then, well, here's our day today. Yeah.
And I mean, each denomination, of course, has a particular interest in their denominational history, and that's no problem. But you're right, and that was, in fact, that was one of the major things that transformed my understanding of eschatology, or the study of the last things. There are so many things that I think that we come to the Bible as Christians with so many preconceived notions that we do not realize. We're just reading the book of Revelation. We're just assuming, well, it just says it clearly right here, but we don't realize that we are actually interpreting into it because we're assuming a lot of our own definitions of things. And I think it. I think I need to give an example of what I mean by that. I think that this is a really important thing. So, the way if we don't know the symbolism of Revelation, well, actually, I think I'm getting off topic because you were talking more about the historical side of things. But that historical period, the War of the Jews, and the destruction of the temple. I'm even planning on probably writing a book on that because I've come to realize that the destruction of the temple was a very key element actually in the gospel and the ministry of Jesus Christ. I didn't realize how much it's referenced. And of course, I think Christians look over it because they don't realize that that's necessarily what's taking place, right? Mm-hmm. And I mentioned already, the one, some of the parables, like, let's see, what was it? I think it was Matthew. What was it? Matthew 22. Yeah, the parable of the wedding feast. You're reading these parables and you're just thinking, this is all the wedding feast for his son. There's the kingdom of heaven, maybe like a wedding feast for his son, and we automatically say, oh, that must be the wedding feast when Jesus returns. He sent his servants to call those who were invited to the wedding feast. Oh yeah, that's like the gospel. But if you read closely, you find a lot of these parables, and I think N.T. Wright has been helpful in coming to a better understanding of the parables. A lot of these parables that we assume are about the second coming, I think are really more about the first coming of Messiah. And this is a classic one, the parable of the wedding feast, Matthew 22, because he talks about how, look, the people who are supposed to be coming to the wedding feast are actually the Jews who were supposed to be expecting Messiah. But the problem is, he says, I prepared my dinner, the oxen, calves are here, but they paid no attention. And while the rest seized his servants, treated shamefully and killed them, the king was angry. So he's telling a story about the wedding feast, and he's saying, the king was angry because who seized his servants and killed them? Well, that's the Jews he's talking about. The Jews rejected his own prophets. And then he says the king was angry, and he sent his troops and destroyed those murderers and burned their city. And then he said to the servants, the wedding feast is ready. Go therefore and invite everyone that you can find. And that's not the end of the world, folks. A lot of times we assume it is because it sounds like judgment, and we automatically assume all judgment in the Bible, from a Western Christian perspective, we assume is universal judgment at the end of the world. But that's not true. And this is a perfect case where that judgment is God judging the Jews by burning the city of Jerusalem. And then he says, go out and invite as many to the wedding feast as you can find. Well, that's the gospel then, the Christians going out and offering the gospel to everybody else in the world. Just like Paul said, when the Jews rejected him, he said, okay, blood is on your hands, I'm now going to the Gentiles. That's exactly what was happening in Paul's ministry. And so I think a lot of these parables have that context, and we need to understand them in that context. And then that's where we go, oh, well, if this event is that important, shouldn't I learn more about it? Because I tell you, until recent years even, most Christians, I would talk to them about it, and they would know almost nothing about it. Many of them hadn't even heard of it. And I'm sitting here thinking, well, wait a minute, if this is really this important that Jesus would go out of his way to give parables about it and warn people it was going to happen, I think we need to know a little bit more about that. So I studied it for years, and I realized that my view and understanding of the end times had been skewed by this modern, basically the typical Left Behind view. That's the best way I call it, Left Behind or dispensationalism. And when I started looking into this different way of seeing it, it shocked me because this is where I started realizing all these assumptions we have. We go to the book of Revelation and we think, oh, surely that's, look at that language. It's so extreme, the earthquakes and all this stuff. And certainly that could never have happened. And you see the language of all the tribes of the earth, right? And all this stuff. But then when you start looking closely, and I start to challenge Christians, look closer. And like I argue, Revelation is not about the judgment about all the earth as we know it. Because when you read that word earth in Revelation, I think it's a very bad translation. Because the word for earth is actually Greek, it's gay. And when we read the word earth, what do we think? We think of a globe, right? Well, they didn't have that concept. And actually, the word is better translated as land. And when you see the word land in there, you start to realize it may not be this earth-wide thing. It may be more of a localized judgment. And people tell me, well, Brian, come on, you can't just say, oh, it doesn't mean earth, it just means land, and walk away like that, as if any old interpretation will do. And what I do is I explain by going to the actual scriptures. You go to Revelation chapter 1, verse 7. And John is giving us the actual theme of Revelation. And this is what he says. Behold, he is coming on the clouds, that's Jesus, and every eye will see him, even those who pierced him, and all the tribes of the earth will wail on account of him. And that's what Christians do. Well, see, that's obviously the judgment of the earth, right? I go, no. If you look at that verse, John is actually quoting another prophecy from Zechariah. All the tribes of the earth will wail. And if you go back and you look at where he's quoting, Zechariah 12, Zechariah says, I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and pleas for mercy, so that when they look on me, on him whom they have pierced, they shall mourn for him as one mourns for a child. On that day, mourning in Jerusalem will be as great, etc. And each family of the tribes of David will weep and wail. And you suddenly realize, the tribes of the earth, it should be called the tribes of the land. And when the ancient Jewish person reads tribes of the land, what does that mean? It means the tribes of the land of Israel. And it proves it because Zechariah clearly says he's talking about the tribes of Israel. So now if you go back into Revelation and you change that word earth, every time you read it and you put it to land, you'll start to see, it's not as worldwide as I thought it was. And the focus is more on the land of Israel as opposed to the globe. And there's just a numerous amount of these little examples that I try to give people that show how one little word, for example, of our misunderstanding in Revelation can completely change the meaning, and we could be missing the meaning that God actually has there for us. And that's what I think has happened with a lot of these futuristic interpretations of Revelation. They've assumed all these, Western futuristic ideas into the text, and so we have to ferret them out one by one. It's a lot of hard work, but I'm up to it, so I'm trying to do that with this series.
Yeah, I think another instance with people misreading the Gospels, I guess, definitely comes in the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24, Luke 21, and Mark 13. They hear about the temple being destroyed, and they think, that must be the temple in Israel right now.
Yeah.
And even if they know the temple has been destroyed, they still think, that still must be the temple in Israel right now. The same thing happens with 2 Thessalonians 2, with the man of lawlessness entering into the temple. It's always, it must be the temple now. And 2 Thessalonians 2 is particularly interesting to me, as if Paul was saying, a second temple is going to be destroyed and a third temple is going to be built. And this prophecy is about that third temple.
Yeah. Or really more accurately, there is no temple right now, so it would be the future temple. They're going to rebuild the temple, because otherwise, what is Jesus talking about? But it's like, wait a minute. The Gospels were written before AD 70. The temple was still standing. Jesus is prophesying about the temple in his time period. It hadn't been destroyed yet. And then, and by the way, as you well know, many scholars have come to admit that this is the case. And so they'll start to admit that, okay, the beginning of Matthew 24 is talking about the destruction of the first temple in 70 AD, but then somewhere in the middle of Matthew 24, at different locations, they try to switch and say, but now Jesus is talking about something future. And I don't think it fits. And that's one of the reasons why I wrote my book, another book called End Times Bible Prophecy. I step through each verse of Matthew 24, and I show how through historical sources and through the Bible, it proves that each one of those prophecies that Jesus relates to the end of the age did in fact occur by 70 AD. And again, these are things that we come to the text that we assume that are not necessarily there. And I think one of the biggest ones of these bad assumptions is these phrases, the last days or the end of the age. And people think, oh, well, the end of the age, that's obviously the end of all time. But no, the word for age is aeon, and it basically is like saying the end of a certain time period. And in fact, the Jews had this notion that there were two ages. There was the present age and the age to come. And the age to come was the age of Messiah. So Jesus is basically saying we are at the end of the age right now because Messiah has come, but Messiah has not yet done his work, right? He has not yet died and risen from the dead. So he was at the end of the old covenant age. See? And so when you read the word last days, again, our modern Western things assume, well, that has to be, last days is obviously the last days of the earth. But not so. If you look up those passages, everywhere it talks about the last days in the New Testament, you see that all the writers believed they were in the last days in their first century. And therefore, what last days means is not the last days of the earth, but the last days of the old covenant. Mm-hmm. And these are the kinds of contexts that they had, but we don't have. And so we have to seek to understand from their eyes and through their eyes. And so, yeah, these are the kind of things that come up a lot. And I think we talked about this even last time I was on there. But it needs to be respoken because there's so many, listen, I am amazed at how many things I find in the New Testament that really clarify these things. Like, for instance, Hebrews 9:26. It says, but now, once at the consummation of the ages, right? The end of the ages, Jesus has been manifested to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. I mean, you couldn't get any clearer than that he's saying the end of the ages is here with the coming of Messiah dying on the cross. And it's like, you can't say, the end of the ages is something future. No. Again, they had that view of the two ages and the age to come. The problem is that, of course, as we all know, too many of the Jews had a concept of a military Messiah who would physically, conquer all his enemies and save them from Rome, et cetera, but they missed the suffering servant and how the warfare that Messiah brought was a spiritual warfare. And they didn't understand that, and they missed it. And I think that's how modern Christians miss it still, because they still place these physical sort of, our own context onto the text, if that makes sense.
Now, I like what you said about other scholars, because, Matthew 24 usually is seen to be a problem passage for Christians. And I remember picking up Bart Ehrman's book, Jesus, Apocalyptic Prophet of the New Millennium, which is his idea of the eschatology of Jesus. And I got that book, and before I even started, I made a personal prediction. I wish I'd written it down somewhere before. I said, I predict that nowhere in this book is Bart Ehrman going to mention or interact with Orthodox preterism. I was right. Nowhere is it mentioned at all.
Unbelievable. That's a dishonesty because he does know better. But what you're indicating is this is the liberal, I think R.C. Sproul, the famed Reformed theologian, was a partial preterist. He became a preterist, Orthodox preterist as well. And he made this very point that part of the reason, in a very real sense, a lot of this futuristic, these Christians predicting, every generation, we're the last generation, Jesus is going to be here, the rapture is going to happen. But when you see the history of how they've been wrong over and over and over again, it actually discredits Christianity as being false because they're, And he goes back to Bertrand Russell and the liberals, and he says, look, they understood that Jesus was saying, no, I'm coming within this generation. I'm coming in this lifetime. But the problem, even those liberals and all the Western mindset, basically, we today, we have this fundamental misunderstanding of the crucial element of what does the parousia or the coming of the Son of Man actually mean? And when when you get to and that's I think that's the crux of the issue, because it was for me when I read through this stuff and preterists were telling me or teaching me, oh, here's where these prophecies were fulfilled. They all made sense, the persecution, even the Great Tribulation. I mean, that was the persecution of the Christians in the first century. It all made sense. But then when you come to verse 30 in Matthew 24, then you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and glory. And we have this automatic assumption, well, that has to be Jesus surfing on a cumulus nimbus cloud, literally, physically in heaven, And I think the thing that was when my whole life changed was when I started to look back into what does this mean to come on the clouds of heaven? And I realized, that I was taught by men much smarter than me, of course. But the idea is it has precedent in the Old Testament, and it's not a literal phrase. It's not a phrase of literalness like Jesus is coming literally on the clouds of heaven, but it's actually a spiritualized metaphor for God coming to judge a nation, a people, or a city. But you have to really you have to see this stuff in the scriptures to be convinced of it. At least I did as a Bible believing Christian, because it's so different from the way we think that it's like, oh, come on, you got to prove that to me, right? But sure enough, when you look into it, it comes out so loud and clear that it's just amazing. So you start looking and you see Isaiah 19:1. God is describing the destruction that he's going to do to Egypt, and he's going to do it using Assyria. And here's what he says, Isaiah 19:1. The oracle concerning Egypt, behold, the Lord is riding on a swift cloud and is about to come to Egypt. And by the way, this is just one of a dozen of Old Testament passages that I chronicle in my book, End Times Bible Prophecy, that describe God comes on the clouds to judge Egypt. He comes on the clouds to judge Babylon. He even comes on the clouds to judge Israel when he uses the armies of Nebuchadnezzar. And so what it is you see, did God literally come surfing in on a cloud? No, of course not. He's basically, the coming on the clouds is a poetic metaphor that describes whenever God uses another army, usually a pagan army, God is using them to fulfill his purposes of judging another nation. And so that's the way he describes it. And so once you realize that, and once you grasp that, and you start to realize, okay, that makes sense, then you go back and you read Jesus saying the same thing, now you start to see, oh, he said that he's going to destroy the temple. And by the way, that happened in 70 AD. And how did it happen? The Roman armies, which were pagan armies, judging Israel. And God said, I was going to judge you through the Roman armies. So now you see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and glory. That is a reference to Jesus vindicating his messiahship to Israel by judging them through the armies of Rome. And that's the sign. In other words, it's not like you see the Son of Man literally in the clouds, and that's a sign, but the sign of Jesus being at the right hand of God in heaven is the judgment on the temple and judgment on Jerusalem, see? And so that's the kind of, that was when I understood that, I became a preterist, because that was the one thing that held me back. And it suddenly made sense in a way that in some ways I think that's the key to our convincing other Christians, I think, because that I think is the biggest impediment, don't you think? That this whole notion of, well, that's obviously the second coming, you know what I mean?
Yeah. When you talk about people who became Orthodox preterists, R.C. Sproul being one, the thing while I worked at COI for a while, I was also a student at Southern Evangelical. And interestingly, when my interview process at COI, they asked, are there any doctrines at SES that you're particularly tied to and such? I said, I'm an Orthodox preterist. Okay, we can move on here, Ben. But anyway, Michael Shermer came for a debate one time with Dinesh D'Souza, I think. I spoke to him a little bit as he left, talking about the debate some and such, but I found later that he went out to eat with Hank Hanegraaff and Stephen Ross, I think it was, both from CRI, of course. Yeah. And Hank Hanegraaff had become an Orthodox preterist, like I said,
Cool.
And the very first question Michael Shermer asked them when they were alone together was, how can you believe Jesus when he got it wrong on the date of his return?
Oh, that's great.
And I understand, I have never heard something like that before.
That is cool. That's great to hear because, I think that's a legitimate complaint by unbelievers, in the sense that they're reading the first half of the text accurately, right? But then, of course, they don't understand the second half in the same way that Christians don't understand the second half. And I think that this is this notion that we have that there can only be one coming of Jesus or whatever. Like he can't come in, like God can't come God can't come in any other way, right? But when you see in the text, God comes many times to destroy many different nations, and he always uses several things. One, he uses three things that keep showing up. One, he describes it as coming in the clouds when he judges a city, a nation, and we're talking the Old Testament here, or a people. Secondly, he describes it as the astronomical bodies are like the sun is turning dark, the moon turns to blood, and the stars fall from the sky. He uses that language as well. And thirdly, he I lost my I lost the track of my thought there.
Well, I'll throw in something then while you try and find it and such. Is that in Revelation 2, for instance, when Jesus has John write to the church in Ephesus, he tells them, repent or else I will come to you. Whoa, the second coming is going to take place if the church in Ephesus doesn't get it right.
Excellent point. So I don't remember what my third point was. Maybe I'll eventually remember. But my point is that God uses this poetic language throughout the Old Covenant all the time when he's going to judge a local people, tribe, or nation, not the whole earth, just a local people, tribe, or nation. And he describes it as, the stars are falling from the sky. He's coming on the clouds. And this language is used all the time. So that, but, when we say that God can't come multiple times, well, of course he can. And the second element of that is just because he uses these extreme metaphors for the sky falling, rolling up like a scroll, it can't mean it's literal, because if he used those terms, like he uses the terms when he judges Babylon in history in the past, he describes it as the sky rolling up like a scroll. So all these Christians that say, well, it has to be literal, well, the sky didn't roll up like a scroll, okay? It's still here. It didn't roll up like a scroll in the past, but God said it did, so therefore you have to understand it as being obviously a poetic metaphor describing the spiritual significance of what is happening. And again, once you understand that, you come back to the New Testament and you see the same language being used by Jesus and the rest of the writers of the New Testament, including Revelation. And then you start to realize, okay, this extreme language in Revelation is not about necessarily the physical things that are happening. It's about the spiritual significance. And if the judgment on Jerusalem was so significant, this is the other element that I try to bring in with people, is I try to explain there's two things that are going on in my mind in Revelation, and two major things. There are more than that, but two things I like to point out is, one, God is basically saying he's going to judge the Jews for rejecting Messiah, and he's going to destroy the incarnation of the Old Covenant. He's going to judge the people who rejected him, and he's going to get rid of the incarnation of the Old Covenant and replace it with the New Covenant. Now, of course, when Christ died and rose from the dead, that was the spiritual inauguration of the New Covenant, absolutely. But what God is doing when he destroys the temple is he is historically vindicating what has already happened at the cross. Because God is not a God of philosophy, he's a God of history, right? If God does something in the spiritual heavenly realm, he will almost, as far as I can see, he always plays it out in history as well to express that spiritual truth. And so what was the incarnation? If God says we have a new covenant, the old covenant's gone, the new covenant is here, why would the old covenant incarnation of the temple still be around? So God's going to get rid of it to prove that the new covenant is here. And it's interesting, it's never been able to be rebuilt since, has it? No. And so he's not only is he destroying the people who rejected him, but he's getting rid of the incarnation of the old covenant to replace it with the new covenant. And what is the new covenant? Well, you read about that in Revelation, 21, right? And the new heavens and new earth. But he says a holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven. And again, Christians assume, well, that has to be some literal city that's miles into the sky and all this stuff. And it's kind of goofy to actually think that way. But John actually tells us what it is. It's not a literal city. Even though he describes all these things, it's a vision. It's a symbol. And he tells us it's a symbol because in Revelation 21, verse 10, he repeats himself and he says, "Come, I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb." Now, we all know that means the bride is the body of Christ, right? Mm-hmm. And he says, "He carried me away in the spirit to a high mountain and showed me the holy city, Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven." So he's saying the bride is the holy city that comes down out of heaven. So he's basically saying this is a symbol of the new covenant, that the body of Christ is the one that comes out of heaven to replace the earthly incarnation of the old covenant, see? And that's kind of how that wraps it up in Revelation 21. But look, all this stuff that we're throwing out here, I'm sure that I'm sure your audience is more familiar than others, but there's still a lot of Christians that it's kind of like, wow, this is, maybe you haven't heard this before, or you're so used to this futuristic view that you hear this and it's just like, it's too new, it's too different. Like it's hard to grasp because it's a completely different paradigm. This is why I'm writing Chronicles of the Apocalypse, because when you read a story, and you can tell me how it's, you've been reading it, you can tell me how it's affected you, but I believe a story can grab people's minds and hearts sometimes in a way that theology can't. It can sort of put flesh on all this abstract, wild stuff, right? And my goal is to tell that story so we're in the first century with the Christians and with the Jews, while the Jews are revolting, and you're seeing what Rome is doing and the battles and how their people are dying and suffering, but also how they're finding Christ in the midst of this. And through that storytelling, I hope to sort of bring out the natural flavor of how Revelation and all this imagery made sense to them, because they're talking about it while it's happening. And that's one of the reasons why I'm writing the series is to sort of put flesh on the bones of the theology, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think it does a really good job of that, because it does get you caught up in the story and even the personal interactions of the characters. I'd like to ask about writing this, kind of maybe a couple things on mind. First, do you have a whole story in mind as you go, or are you kind of writing parts and thinking, now, how am I going to get these characters out of this dilemma and such? And then the second one I'd like to know about is, do you find it difficult to take real historical figures and mix their lives in with fictional characters as well?
Yeah, those are two good questions. And please remind me if I forget by the time I get to the second one, because I got a bad memory. Okay, so the first one's a very good question. As a storyteller, a lot of times what we do is we do think through a lot of it in advance, and we outline. I do outline a lot of it, and I do have an idea of where I want it to end, because the ending of a story is sort of the meaning of the story. It kind of brings meaning. And so if you don't have a belief about meaning in life, you're not going to know how it should end. But if you do, then you should have an idea of how it should end. And so when I write a story, I do sort of I work out a basic outline of the things that happen and how they lead one thing to another, how they lead to the end. And I already know kind of how I want to end it. However, in the process of, once you outline, you work out that's like working out the theme. It's like working out the sort of the meaning and the big picture. But when you actually sit down and write it, there is a lot of cases like certain scenes. I'll go, okay, this is going to be an action scene where there's a fight, but I don't know how it's going to happen. And sometimes I just enter into it and I try to get my hero or my heroine into a difficult fix that I don't even know how they're going to get out of it. Because then I know the reader's going to think, how are they going to get out of this? It's going to be more entertaining, right? And but then, then I'll spend hours or days sometimes trying to figure out what would be a really creative yet believable way to get out of this. So on a micro level, I don't always know how things are going to end, but on a macro level, I do know, like, sort of organically what should happen. Because, for instance, I'm going to know. Well, of course, I'm following the Book of Revelation. So, but I mean, if I know, like, I want my character to start out as an unbeliever and end as a believer, then I know I'm going to have him go through the process of the story. He's going to have all these ups and downs in terms of his heart and soul. But of course, I don't have just unbelievers become believers. I have some believers become unbelievers because right? Isn't real life like that? Don't we know people who believe and then they lose their faith? And I want to be so realistic that I want to show what does it look like when someone loses their belief and what are their thought processes to that. But in the course of doing that, as a writer, I have a belief system of why people give up their faith. And I don't think it's always I don't think it's a legitimate thing. So that will come out in the course of that. And that's what I do as a writer. So as writers, we're guided by meaning, but that doesn't mean that you're like a writer of a sermon where you're trying to preach to someone. It just means that when I'm telling a story, I'm trying to do two things. I'm trying to entertain, number one. And then secondly, I'm guided by my worldview to the choices I make for what happens next, because the worldview determines how things end up. And so the worldview comes into the story, but the more organic it is, the more believable it is for people, and the less preachy it is. And that's what I hope I've done with my story. But that's the answer to the first question.
And the second one was, is it difficult to take real historical characters and mesh their lives in with fictional characters?
That's a real difficult situation because there are, as a storyteller, it's not for me, because I actually prefer it, because I think, let's see, some of my favorites. Look, I love movies more than books sometimes, and I love seeing true stories, but I know that they're also fictionalized to some degree, to make it entertaining. And so as a storyteller, you have to sort of have some standards. And what I mean by that is, if you know anything about history, you know that if I were to claim to be a historian writing the true history of something, I'm not writing fiction, right? We have to realize by now in today's postmodern world that there's no such thing as objective history. Everything's fictionalized to a certain degree because no one really knows what goes on, and people who write down things that even eyewitnesses who were there, we know now that a lot of them contradict each other, right? And so there's differences of perspective, there's differences of opinion. All this stuff comes into even historical writing. And once you realize that reality, which is why we get, you'll read some history, and it'll be a dishonest history about something. You see, this person has an agenda. They're twisting and spinning everything to support their agenda. So my point here is that even if you're writing nonfiction history, you are fictionalizing because you weren't there. And if you were there were 20 people there, and all 20 of them had different perspectives. So when I'm writing fiction, I tell people, look, I'm not doing much different from what historians are doing, but I am adding a more open level that I'm saying, okay, I'm adding something fictional here. So what I try to do is this. But I want to have standards because I don't believe that truth is relative, right? So even though I don't believe that we can't know every perfect factual detail because you'd have to be God, right? So therefore, even the Bible fictionalizes, right? Because, first of all, the belief in inspiration is not that God dictated it. That was never Orthodox Christian belief. It was that God through the Holy Spirit inspires them, but there are men who are writing this, and they're interacting with other sources, and they're talking to eyewitnesses. So nobody was there when Jesus was talking to Pilate. It was only Jesus and Pilate. But you've got like a conversation going on there. Well, I'm sorry, but that's fictionalized. It doesn't mean it didn't happen, and it doesn't mean that what the gospel writers said wasn't true. But what I'm saying is sometimes fiction is God's ordained means of communicating the truth, see? And so what I try to do is I try to have standards, say, okay, I don't believe truth is relative. I can't just make up anything I want. So I try to know, I do research to know all the historical characters, whether it's Vespasian, Titus. I have some famous Jewish characters like Herod Agrippa and Berenice, his sister. So I try to do research so I'm true to their character and spirit and what we do know they did. And I'll have some historical events that were written about them. But then my main characters are fictional characters. So the people that we're following, some of the people that we're following in the story are fictional, but I make them fictional so that they can interact with the historical characters so we can see history from a new angle, a fresh angle, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And, so it is a little presumptuous sometimes when you're writing about some famous character and how do I know what Nero really thought like, right? But I look at Nero's actions that we do have in history and the speculation that multiple historians talk about him. And I drew from that, for example, that he wasn't a madman. I don't think he was a madman in the way that we always say, oh, he's a madman, fiddling while Rome burned. No, he wasn't a madman, actually. He wasn't always like this fanatical evil guy either. He did some good things for Rome. But I depict him as sort of the celebrity artist as emperor because he perceived of himself as an artist, and he actually loved his art more than ruling, in the empire. And I thought, well, what would it be like what is that like? That's sort of like taking a Hollywood movie star and making them the emperor. What kind of temperament? Well, we know what the temperament of actors is, right? It's really childish, and if they have all the power in the world and they're childish, this is the kind of things that they do. They lash out, they destroy and kill people they don't like. And so I try to capture that truth of that personality of Nero, even if I don't know everything he did. But I do try to bring in as many historically documented events or incidents that I can into the story. And so my standard is I want to get as many of the real facts in my story as possible, and I don't want to contradict it. And if I write anything fictional, I want it to be consistent with what we know, even if what I'm saying is made up, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So it's sort of like filling in between the lines, historically we may know, oh, this character traveled from Rome to Ephesus. That's all we know. So I'm going to tell the story of what happened on the boat while he's traveling from Rome to Ephesus, and that sort of fills in between the lines. And of course, I do that with Patmos and my characters in the story. Basically Nero finds out. Okay, so here's a classic example of what I did. So we know that Revelation is apocalyptic literature, right? Yeah. What is apocalyptic literature? It's literature that it's very heavily symbolic. And one of the reasons why prophets sometimes wrote apocalyptically was because it was like coding it so that they wouldn't get executed by the emperor, And so, for instance, if John were to write something like, Nero is the beast and he's going to die, well, obviously people are going to go after him, right? So instead, he covers it up in language that the Jews might understand because it's in their context, but not necessarily the Romans. So I think scholarship shows that apocalyptic literature can be very subversive. And so I take that and I say, okay, well, imagine the Christians are being persecuted during the time of Nero. And, the historical evidence that I found, I believe that John was imprisoned on Patmos during the days of Nero. It was part of the persecution, right? That's when Paul and Peter were executed. That's when John was imprisoned. Everything was just going down. And so if he writes this, God gives him this vision, but it's encouraging the Christian Jews to have faith because big suffering's coming, the destruction of Jerusalem's coming, and John said, I'm a partaker in the tribulation with you right now, right? He says that in chapter 1, verse 7, I'm a partaker in the tribulation with you. So the tribulation's going on. John is writing this. So I thought, well, that'd be interesting. And I thought, so subversive, it's secret. The Christians probably even kept it secret. So I said, what if Nero heard that there was this subversive letter going around? And it talked about the end of the world and the assassination of the emperor. Of course, he hears the gossip because that's what it really means, but we know that it's so much more than that, right? So the premise of my series is I have Nero send out a Roman warrior who has a Jewish doctor, his personal doctor, and a Christian slave who's a woman, and they go hunting, trying to find this letter that the Christians are hiding and who wrote it, and kill him if you can. And so that way you get the perspective from a Roman, a Christian, and a Jew of all the stuff that's going on. And they ultimately do find, it's written by John. They go there, but then they find out it's not what they thought it was. And they find out what it is. And there's also some conversions that occur here and there. And people sort of change their minds and such. And then ultimately they end up finding their way to Jerusalem to try to tell the Christians, this is another thing we don't, we know that, look, we don't even know how many Christians got the letter of Revelation. So what if the Christians in Jerusalem hadn't gotten the letter yet? They had the prophecies that Jesus said, but they didn't get Revelation. And so I have my characters trying to get the letter there and try to persuade the Christians, look, this was written by John, so you've got to get out of Jerusalem because Rome is coming. But not all the Christians wouldn't necessarily believe them, right? Because some of them might not even know, well, how do you know John wrote this? How do we really know, right? So it's sort of like I'm fictionalizing what the world might be like, but in the context of what we do know about that time period and what we know about the letter of Revelation, which is very little. And so that's why you've got to have that fiction. But I think the purpose of fiction is to put flesh on the abstraction, and it is to give concrete meaning, historical meaning, storied meaning to these things, whether it's history or theology or what have you. And that's why I say that I write theological novels, because I feel like I'm doing all of that together. I'm trying to be historically truthful, but also theological and biblical, and to write an entertaining story.
Mm-hmm. And in fact, I remember emailing you, I think sometime shortly after it was done, because your main love in pop culture is movies. Yeah. Mine would be games. And I'd said, I could picture this series as an RPG of sorts. Have you ever considered that? And I think you said it's not, it's not in the cards right now, but I thought this could be something that you could make for like an app for your phone. Game. So, if anyone out there is very enterprising and is interested in doing this, I'm sure Brian would love to have your support here.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. But the problem is games are big ventures, and you need a team of committed guys and women who are willing to put a lot of speculation, effort, and work into a project without getting paid before you can sell the project to the big money and get it made. And so that's what I don't have connections on. I don't have connections with people who can do programming, who can do all that kind of stuff, who can sort of help me put together the package. So yeah, unfortunately, that's what it really needs. But you're right. I think it would. It could be a really cool RPG. Absolutely.
Well, I interviewed someone once on God in video games. Maybe I'll get in touch with him and see if he knows anyone who'd be interested in this. At this point, I remind everyone you're listening to Deeper Waters podcast. We got Brian Godawa as our guest here this week. But if you're listening next week, we're going to have Greg Kutsana on. He's going to be talking about his book, Mere Science and Christian Faith. What about Christianity and science, especially talking with young people, the millennials and such, is Christianity anti-science? How do we answer questions about science? So that's what we're going to be talking about next week here. Now, something else to understand also about this series is you've incorporated a lot of the ideas about the Watchers into it, for Nephilim and things like that. Now, you and I have talked about this before, but I'm still not sold on the whole idea and such. But the good thing is, you don't have to be, and you can still enjoy the story. I can look at and say, I'm going to have, like suspended disbelief for a time, and it's still an exciting story.
Yeah, and I try to tell people, I'm like, look, again, this is a theological novel, so I don't believe this is how it literally looks, because I have, for example, you mentioned the Watchers and stuff. So I actually have all these different, what you're referring to, if in case the audience doesn't know, is one of the main premises that I follow is what I would call the Watcher paradigm. And, there are, you can see this in Daniel, for instance. Daniel does talk about the Watchers, so it's not something that's completely made up or whatever. But the notion, the idea is that, I'll try to be as brief as possible, but I do think the Psalm 82 is a great summary of the picture that I'm using. And the idea is that at the Tower of Babel, and Deuteronomy 32, verses 8 through 10 talk about this. It says, when God split, divided the nations and all that, it basically describes that God, because man kept rebelling against Yahweh, right? He floods the earth, and man still rebels and builds the Tower of Babel. So God splits the languages, divides them on the earth, and he says, okay, look, if you're going to continue to rebel like this against me and worship other gods, it says then that he allots the nations to the authority of the sons of God. And the sons of God I take to be a reference to these angelic host of heaven that were fallen from God's heavenly counsel. But the idea there is that he's saying, since you are going to worship me, I'm going to give over all the Gentile nations to these gods. They're going to be under their authority, but I will keep Jacob for myself. And so the picture is that all these different, nations, the 70 nations of Genesis 11, that's the context of the Bible, all these nations that we see as the pagan nations, they don't worship God, and they're under false gods, which are actually spiritually real beings, they are these watchers and such. And the idea is that as time goes on, then God takes his people, he takes the land of Canaan for his land, kicks out the people there and their gods, but all the other lands have their authorities over them and their spiritual principalities and powers. And Paul writes about this. He says, we don't fight against flesh and blood. What was happening at the time? The Roman authorities were persecuting Christians. He's saying, look, it's not the earthly authorities that we're fighting, it's the spiritual authorities behind them. This notion that there are spiritual principalities and powers behind the earthly powers. And so, but here's the thing. But when Messiah comes, he changes everything, because what he does is, whereas in the Old Covenant, Deuteronomy and such, you have Yahweh and his people, the nation of Israel on the single plot of land of Judea, right? And everybody else is other gods under other gods, and all the territories are under other nations. But then when Messiah comes, what does he say? He says, Messiah comes and he sort of takes back the inheritance rights. He takes back the allotted territories or the lands of all these false gods. With his resurrection, he takes it back, and he inherits the earth. And what do all the messianic prophecies say? Messiah will inherit the earth, right? He will inherit all the land. So what happens is when Messiah comes, that little land of Israel becomes transformed, and it's no longer just this one physical people in their land, but it's now I will draw in people from all the nations. They were once under bondage to other gods, but now they're not under bondage. And now they will come in through the gospel. People from every tribe and nation can now come into the people of God. And the land, the promised land, is no longer this one little plot. It's the whole earth, because Messiah owns the whole earth, right? And so when Jesus ascends to heaven, sits at the right hand of God on the throne of God, he is now king over all the earth, not just the plot of Israel. So he's won back the nations, he's won back the territories, the authority, and now those principalities are defeated. And so that's what I believe is the spiritual theology of what is going on. What does that literally look like? I don't know, because God gives us a glimpse here and there, like in Daniel, right? He gives us a glimpse of these princes at battle, but we don't really know what happens. So in my series, I have these various gods of the nations, right? And they're the spiritually fallen beings, but they become the false gods over the nations. And they're fighting to keep their land and their territory, right? So there's the spiritual fighting and battle that's going on in the heavens, so to speak, while the earthly war of the Jews is going on with Rome. And so, yeah, and Satan's in there, in the book of Revelation, there is a reference to the angel of the abyss. And what is that called? It's called Apollyon. I'm going to try to find the passage there if I can.
So Revelation 9.
Yeah. So Revelation 9, it goes, when the locusts come out of the abyss and all that stuff, and it says they have a king over them, the angel of the abyss. His name is, in Hebrew, is Abaddon, and in Greek is Apollyon. Now, I'm sort of look, it's really, we don't always know all the interpretations of these things, but I'm following Ken Gentry, who's a scholar who is going to have a Revelation commentary coming out this year from a preterist perspective that, in my opinion, will be a game changer in Revelation commentaries. It's going to blow the lid off of this stuff. It's really good. I got the privilege of being able to use it as research for my novel series. And he makes the argument that if you look at the symbolism throughout Revelation, this Apollyon is probably another name for Satan, or the Satan, actually, technically is what it is. We don't know for sure, but I have that in my story. So Apollyon is my main villain in my story, because he's going to be the king over the abyss that lets loose these demons and such. And I try to explain what that is symbolically through the text, because while I do believe it's symbolic, I still think there are historical reference to it, right? So, for example, I would say, okay, what is the beast, right? The beast with 7 heads. Well, I think symbolically that refers to the Roman Empire, and the 7 heads are 7 kings, which are Caesars. And Revelation 17 describes that the 6th head, 5 heads were dead. The 6th head of the dragon currently is, and there's a 7th yet to come. And I believe that was talking about Nero was the 6th Caesar. He's the 6th head alive at that time. And so even though I think the dragon and his heads are symbolic, I think they refer to specific historical things. But what I do in my story is I have, in the spiritual realm, I have these monsters like Leviathan with 7 heads and such, So I kind of integrate history with the symbolism to sort of help bring out the meaning of the text, And that's where I feel like it helps explain it in as best a way as I can through the stories. But yeah, look, no matter how you interpret Revelation, there certainly is this sense of some kind of spiritual warfare is going on, right? And what does that really look like? Especially if this is symbolic, then we don't really know what it looks like. So I'm taking a stab at it, and that's one of the ways that I do it. But so in a way, my series is a combination of Ken Gentry and Michael Heiser, where I've got the Divine Council Watcher paradigm going on, but I also have the Orthodox preterist interpretation of Revelation that shows how all this stuff works together. And it's actually, I think it's quite a neat fit.
Since you mentioned Michael Heiser, I'll go ahead and give people a teaser. 2 weeks from now on the show, Michael Heiser. He's going to be our guest. And,
awesome.
when you talk about how there's something spiritual going on, Revelation, I remember several years ago, whoever it was watching a football game, but I was on an online chat forum and such, and it wasn't a forum, but it had a chat feature on there and such. And someone starts typing all of a sudden, Saints win! Saints win! All in caps. And I just said, he must have finished reading the book of Revelation.
Yeah, that's a good one. That's a good one. So you're gonna interview Michael about his book Unseen Realm?
And now we're actually going to be talking about Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah,
gotcha. Cool.
Let's talk some about the destruction of Jerusalem, since that plays a little role in your book. I think it does.
Yep.
Something that intrigued me so much, and it's human nature, but you can't believe it sometimes when you read it and such, is that here you have the armies of Rome coming to destroy Jerusalem, and you think this would be the time all Jerusalem says, we got to come together and defeat, but and now Jerusalem's still fighting amongst itself over who's going to be in charge and such. It'd be so comic if it wasn't real.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. That's one of the fascinating things. So for your audience, there is one major detailed source that we have of this 7-year period, basically, of these 3.5 year period of the war. And it's written by Josephus, the Jewish historian, and it's called The Wars of the Jews. And but what's so fascinating about it is that it was written by Josephus, was a Jewish Pharisee who actually was fighting in the war against the Romans. But he got captured, and he felt, and he decided to go over and help the Romans because he felt that Israel was being judged or chastised for her faithlessness to Yahweh. So his message was, Jews, surrender. Rome won't destroy you if you just surrender. So he was trying to get them. So you see how he was a loyal Jew, but he also felt like the Romans, interestingly, just in the same way that we preterists believe, he believed that the Romans were God's instrument of humbling the Jews. Mm-hmm. And so his history is a fascinating mixture of pro-Roman, pro-Jewish. And so you can read between the lines and just some amazing, interesting things come out of the text. But my point to it is, he goes into detail because he was in the Roman camp, so he knew what was going on there. And he was intimately, obviously as a Jew, he had intimate connection with Jews who were also in the city. He went through the event, and so later on, when he became a Roman subject, he became the official Roman court historian for Vespasian. He wrote this story under that. And so he tells about what's going on. And one of the thing that you mentioned was, I find it was just fascinating because what happened was, Rome is basically taking out the surrounding country land. And there were a lot of fortified cities that held out. Jotapata, Gamala, and some of these other cities that had forts, so they were pretty strong. And so it took them a while. Like I said, it took them 3.5 years, right? So and so you had all these Jewish forces that were sent out to protect these various areas. But as the areas were taken down, Galilee, Samaria, the surviving soldiers would escape and go to Jerusalem, right? And of course, they all knew that the ultimate end was going to be Jerusalem, but nonetheless. Then what happens is because of the messianic fever in the air, and this is fulfillment of Jesus' prophecy, right? Jesus said, many messiahs are going to come say, he's here, he's there, but don't believe him. Well, basically what happened was, they had various bandits or bands of warriors who were together. Like, for instance, you had the Zealots. And the Zealots were, they considered themselves zealous for the temple. And then you also had the Sicarii. And the Sicarii were assassins who killed Jewish leaders who they thought were Roman sympathizers. So, because of course, and then you have the Herodians. And who were the Herodians? The Herodians were the ones who were basically the aristocracy ruling over Israel, and they were pro-Roman. So within Israel, you have pro-Roman, anti-Roman, right? And so that's where you start to get this division that occurs. And then what happens is, there's a guy named John of Gischala who's one of the general leaders, and he hates Josephus. Well, anyway, he comes back to the city, and the city has its own rulers, but he tries to take over the city because there's also megalomaniacs like John of Gischala, or they think they're Messiah. So he can't do it. So he ends up barricading himself in the temple, and he takes over the outer temple courtyard. Then another guy called Eleazar, who was a captain of the temple guard, he takes over the inner temple. That's the marble structure that we know of as the temple, because he hates John of Gischala. Mm-hmm. Then on the outside of the city, all the city people, or the city rulers, they called in a guy called Simon Bar Giora, because he was a warrior who had defeated a lot of Idumea. He was kind of like a rebel who had control of 20 to 30,000 men, in battle. And they said, "Come help us take the city away from John of Gischala." So Simon comes into the city, and he battles with John of Gischala. So you've got John of Gischala in the temple fighting against Simon Bar Giora on the outside city, and all these innocent people, of course, have collateral damage, right? But then, because they're all pretty devout in relation to the Jewish feasts, they make these treaties and say, okay, during the Passover or during whatever feast, we will not attack you, and you let in all the Jewish citizens who have to do their thing for the sacrifices, and we promise we won't attack you. And then after the feast, they go back to fighting against each other. Meanwhile, Rome is coming down upon them, right? And so that's what you're talking about, how there's the civil war. And it's interesting because there's actually I don't have it at my fingertips here, but in Revelation there is a verse that talks about, I'm trying to find it right now as I'm speaking. Here it is. Okay. So Revelation 16, the seventh bowl and all this, there's a great earthquake splits the city into 3 parts, right? And the city is Jerusalem. And again, this is not a literal earthquake. It doesn't split the city literally into 3 parts, obviously. What I think it's referring to is this 3-part division that I just described to you, which is Simon Bar Giora controlling the outer city, John of Gischala controlling the outer temple, and Eleazar controlling the inner temple. And Josephus writes about these guys. The city was split into 3, he says. So there's one example again how Revelation might fit to it. But it is amazing if you read Josephus. There are times when he uses language that it sounds like he's quoting from Revelation, but he's not a Christian. But the language that he describes, it is so amazing. Like, for instance, he describes the inner temple and the curtain with the images on it. And he basically says it's like the temple was an image of the cosmos or the universe. And so the temple, when you have the temple falling, it's like the stars and moon falling from the sky, that kind of stuff. So Josephus uses that similar language, biblical language that we know. And so sometimes we even, that's how we understand some of the biblical languages, because Josephus is doing something very similar. And he even says, Josephus, that he believed that Vespasian was the fulfillment of the messianic promise of Daniel. Now, Daniel 9, that we believe, obviously, that was Jesus, the prince to come was Jesus. But Josephus believed, he said, well, look, Cyrus was God's anointed Messiah, right? So God sometimes uses pagan leaders to be, in other words, when they use the word Messiah, it doesn't just mean it like we understand it. There were multiple Messiahs through history, meaning there were great people who saved the nation. So he said Cyrus was a Messiah, so I believe Vespasian is the Messiah that was promised, because he is the one that is going to bring God's judgment. See what I'm saying? And that's what he believed. Now, I don't think that he was right, but that shows us that even he had this understanding that God will use the pagan forces And he says this, that God uses the pagan forces to chastise and judge Israel. And that's the Messiah. So it's in Josephus, you read his story, and it's amazing how closely it aligns with Revelation. And in fact, that's what Ken Gentry is doing in his new Revelation. He goes through Revelation, and there's a lot of quotes from Josephus to show how these things are connected. And I think that people are really going to love that when it comes out.
Well, I'd like to remind everyone at this point, you're listening to the Deeper Waters podcast. Everything we do here, it's listener supported by people like you and people in our Facebook Live audience. And if you'd like to support that, please go to deeperwatersapologetics.com. It's my website there. And there's a link, help support the work of Deeper Waters Christian Ministries. You click on that link, and you get taken to Risen Jesus. Have you gone to the right place? Yeah, you have. Mike and Debbie Lacona run that site, and they're my in-laws. So you make your donation to Risen Jesus, and then you get in touch with me, or Mike or Debbie, or my wife, Allie, and say, hey, I made a donation. I want to give it to Nick Peters. I want to go to Deeper Waters. And we will make sure that we get a donation. It will be tax deductible. You can also buy some ebooks that I have written, such as A Creed for the Ages, The Apostles' Creed in Today's Christian, or Coven, Defying Inerrancy, Groundless, God and Natural Disasters, and others. And another way you can support us is by, another ebook you could get is the Mentionables Project. It's a very popular one right now. And another way you can support us is jewelry. You can go and buy for our jewelry store. My friend Lena Clastor handles that in. Just let me know about it. And whatever you purchase, 25% of that goes to Deeper Waters. And guys, you especially need to listen to this, because the ladies in your life like jewelry. And you can do what I've always told you. You can buy something special for your wife or girlfriend, to make up that big screw-up that you recently did with them. Or you can buy something for them to make up that big screw-up that I know you're going to make with them. And if you can't do any of these, please go on iTunes and leave a positive review of the Deeper Waters podcast. I really love to see them, guys. They mean so much. Brian, do you have an organization or a charity you'd like to see people donate to?
Yeah, I really, one of the ones that I give regularly to is Alliance Defending Freedom. And I think their website is adflegal.org. But, you can just type in Alliance Defending Freedom. And the reason why I think that they're so important is these guys are Christian lawyers who take on court cases for freedom of expression, but also against the persecution of Christians. And for instance, they were involved in the latest Supreme Court decision that favored the Christian baker. So these guys are really they've really done significant legal work to help protect Christians from being persecuted in America as well as in other places. But I think their focus is mostly in America. So yeah, those guys are. Hey, if you support them, you're kind of helping to protect yourself as well. So there's a little bit of selfishness there, but at this point, you're helping other Christians who are being persecuted by people for their faith right now by using the law, and that's a powerful thing.
Mm-hmm. And recently, we've interviewed on this show John Stewart and Abdi Murray, both of whom are trained in law as lawyers. So yes, people believe it or not, there really are Christian lawyers out there, as far as it might seem to believe. Now, moving back to the destruction of Jerusalem, one thing I do want to say right quick as kind of an aside is I regularly deal with so many people who say, well, the mythicist crowd, for instance, says, well, surely Jesus should have been talked about. And I really liked it when you said that thing about the destruction of Jerusalem. In fact, that was also a major global event for people, and yet we have pretty much one source that writes about it, just one. And so when people raise these kinds of objections, like, you really don't understand how things work in the ancient world.
Yeah, that's true. I'm not sure I was catching where you wanted to go with this.
Yeah. Now let's move back then to the destruction of Jerusalem. And something else we can miss about it is we live in a day and age. I mean, if people are watching on Facebook Live, they can see I've got a glass here. It's got a cup here. It's got tea in it, the nectar of the gods, the most sacred beverage God created, and we got everything we need right here in our homes. If I wanted to refill a glass of water nearby, I just go to the faucet and refill it. Our pantry stocked with food, got a refrigerator food in it, and they didn't have all that back then. And we forget how well clean running water and food and such would be such a necessity in a city, especially if you were under siege.
Yeah. You were going in and out a little bit there, Nick. I have to apologize. I couldn't hear everything.
Mm-hmm.
Could you just could you briefly recap that?
Yeah, we're pretty much just saying that we live in a day and age where we have everything we need. We have water, we have food.
Right.
And it's all there. We are stocked for a long time, and if we need anything, hey, you just go down to the grocery store.
Oh, right.
You got it and such. They didn't have that back then.
Yes, you're right. And this is an interesting thing because when the siege occurred, Rome surrounds the city of Jerusalem, and it was 5 months of the actual siege, which is interesting because the book of Revelation says that when the locusts are released, they don't hurt the land, they only hurt people, and it was going to occur for 5 months. So I think those locusts are a symbolic reference to the demonic infestation of the Roman armies, so to speak. Again, not necessarily literal, but a spiritual way of describing these Roman forces and how they besieged the temple the city for 5 months. Anyway, in the course of that, what walled cities do, they would often have, storages of food and stuff. And by the way, there's also, one of the, in Revelation where it talks about how, a great famine occurs and what does it say? A loaf of bread is bought for, $1,000 or whatever, there's that reference. And I think that's another symbolic way in Revelation of referring to the fact that there's a famine going on and as well as, a complete lack of food. And so inside the city, what happened was a very fascinating thing. They would normally have a lot of rations and stores to keep them for a long time, years. But here's what happened. The siege began in April, right at the time that the Passover was occurring. And at the Passover, that was, of course, many pilgrims from all over Israel as well as other nations would come to Jerusalem. So you would have sometime, Josephus argues as many as, I think, 1 million there. Some people say it's not possible, or 600,000 at least, right? Mm. And they're all around the city, and a lot of them are outside the city, and then they're engaging in the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, right? Well, the siege begins there, so they all go inside the city. So the city is not just normal, it's actually overcrowded. And they're stuck. They're stuck for 5 months. But there's another thing that occurs that is just amazing. That civil war we talked about, these guys were so, in a way, they're so demonic with each other. The John of Gischala and Simon Bar Giora, the guys who were fighting amongst each other, what they did was they would try to destroy each other's food stores. So John of Gischala would lead a pack of men outside of the temple on a sortie, what they call them, right? A little military mission. And they'd go and they'd burn down one of the silos of food and go back to the temple. And they're deliberately doing it to each other so that they could, so that you'll starve type of thing. But what happens is they end up burning a large portion of each other's food rations. So they're in the midst of this civil war, surrounded, besieged, and they're burning up their food stores. So what happened was they did end up having a massive famine, and they ran out of food. And they're surrounded by Rome, and so they have these cases where there's so many people dying and dead bodies inside, they can no longer keep them they can't bury them, right? Because Rome is out there surrounding the city. They can't. So the only way they can get rid of them is to dump them over the wall. And so a lot of them were dumped into the Valley of Hinnom. Bodies just piled high, the dead bodies of people dying from famine. And again, this was all what Revelation was saying, right? And there's a famous incident that Josephus writes about that typifies, it sort of embodies the kind of problem that was going on. And it was an incident of cannibalism where he describes this woman, how she, these soldiers are basically, they're going and they're pillaging inside the city. They're pillaging their own citizens to get food so that they can have food to fight the Romans, right? So it's just this massive self-destruction going on. Anyway, they describe some incident where some soldiers break into a house and there's this woman there and she's cooking her baby and eating half of it. And she says, here, you can have the other half. So it's like she goes mad and she eats her own child. In other words, the famine was so bad that people were cannibalizing one another. Mm-hmm. And that which was a really, devastating case of what's going on. So yeah, in fact, I think there was in the first temple destruction of Babylon, when Babylon destroyed the first temple in around 586 BC, there was a phrase. Let me see if I can find it. I don't know if I can. No, I can't. I'm sorry. I don't have the little phrase, but God talks about the first destruction of the city, and He does talk about you will kill each other and eat one another. And so in a very similar way, the same thing happens again when the temple is destroyed the second time. And it's interesting because Josephus claims that the temple in AD 70 was burned down on the same day that it was burned down the first time, which is really sort of a miraculous sort of coincidence by God's hand, right? He makes it burn down on the same day that it was in the first time in Babylon, And that was another fascinating little factoid that you find when you read this stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think people really miss out how severe it was. And that was, in fact, part of the prediction in Deuteronomy 28 of what would happen when people are turned away from the covenant. And to me, this is a great argument, in fact, for who Jesus was, because the reason this happened to Israel at that time was Israel abandoned the covenant by rejecting Jesus.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's huge. And that's the kind of thing that people just don't realize that this historic transformation is rooted in a judgment, and the judgment is so spiritually serious that God uses this kind of universal, it's sort of like the destruction of the universe is happening. Why? Because His own people rejected Him, and then He's going to reject them. And by the way, this is one of the things that I write about in the novel series that okay, so you've got the let me see if I can find these here. Okay, you got the seals and the trumpets and all that kind of stuff, right? Mm-hmm. Well, without going into too much detail, those are the things: the seals and the trumpets and the bowls, like all this destruction, and that's where some of these things you can see the metaphors connecting with the destruction of the temple. Because if the temple represents the cosmos, as the Jews thought it did, and the Old Testament said it did, the cosmos meaning, the spiritual cosmos, well, then the destruction of that is like the destruction of the cosmos. So it would make sense that all these language in the trumpets and the bowls would have this cosmic, great, grandiose language of massive destruction, right? But there are many little cases. We already mentioned one where it talks about the city being split into three, but there's another one where this is just a little example, but I'm trying to find it right now, and I can't, but people will know. I can find it here. There it is. Revelation 8, first angel blew his trumpet, and there followed hail and fire. That's not it. Okay, seventh bowl. I'm sorry. Seventh bowl, he's saying, and the islands fled away and no mountains were to be found. That's obviously symbolic because, the islands and mountains don't fly away. And it says, and great hailstones, about 100 pounds each, fell from heaven on people, and they cursed God because of the hail. And these are the kind of things where, like, sometimes they're somewhat literalistic, sometimes they're purely symbolic. But Josephus writes about when the Romans surrounded the city, they did several things. They had siege towers, which were like huge towers on wheels that they wheel up to the wall, and that's how they would try to, overcome the walls. But they also had battering rams, and that literally they had the head of a ram, like an iron head of a ram on a log inside of a covered wagon. They roll it up to the wall, and they ram the walls with the ram, right? So they have battering rams. But they also had a lot of catapults. They built these, like hundreds of these catapults that would launch huge arrows or stones. And Josephus describes how they would take the stones and, I kid you not, paint them white. And he says the stones were about a talent, which is what? 100 pounds. And hail is white. So here you've got like, wow, there's like a possible symbolism that's describing, a lot of these judgments are describing the war and the battle upon Jerusalem, and some of them reflect the kind of things that are going on here. The hailstones from the sky, 100 pounds. Well, that's like the catapult rocks, right? It's like hailstorm, right? And there are other cases where he says something like, we read some of the other bowls and the trumpets. It says, all the sea was turned blood red with the bodies of the dead. Well, okay. Josephus describes the Sea of Galilee. There were battles, Tiberias and some of the sea cities there on the Sea of Galilee. When the Romans came in, they slaughtered them, and then some of the Jewish warriors tried to flee on boats into the Sea of Galilee, and the Romans chased them, and they had battles on the water. And Josephus describes the sea was blood red, even fish were dying in it. And that's exactly what Revelation says. All the fish died, right? So it uses extreme language, all the fish died. Well, it's not all the fish. That's the kind of poetic hyperbole that he uses. But the point is, fish are dying, the sea is clogged, and Josephus says the sea was clogged with dead bodies. He says that the Jordan was clogged with dead bodies that Titus killed as they were floating down towards the Dead Sea. And so, in other words, in a very real sense, yeah, the Jordan River, the Dead Sea, the Sea of Galilee, the seas were blood were filled with blood red and filled with bodies, and Josephus uses that same language, and it's kind of an extreme language too, because obviously the whole sea wasn't clogged with bodies, right? Mm-hmm. But that's the kind of language that they're using to describe the physical horror of war is not as serious as the spiritual horror of why it's going on, and that's what Revelation is trying to tell us, But that's where the language of Josephus, it's just amazing. Like I said, you're reading him, and it's almost like, is this guy a Christian? Because he's using a similar language. Of course he isn't. And that's what makes it even more reliable from a Christian perspective, because, if Josephus was a Christian, he's writing this, people would just say, oh, he's just trying to make it sound like it's connected to Revelation, right? But he's not. And so this is why in the early church years, we're talking like, the second century, the third and the fourth century, a lot of the church fathers actually read Josephus a lot. And they referred to him a lot because of the fact that they saw him writing about the fulfillment of a lot of these prophecies.
I think something else we can say about the destruction is that the area used to be very heavily forested and stuff.
Yes.
But it stopped being that because the Romans cut down so many trees because they were crucifying Jews left and right.
Not only that, but they were clear cutting all the trees and stuff because in order to siege a temple, to siege a fortified city, and you got to remember there's fortified cities all over Israel. So in order to do that, they had to build huge ramps that would traverse a valley, kind of like Masada. You know how everyone knows about how they built the big ramp up to Masada? Well, they had to do that all the time throughout all the cities. So in a way, you're right. They cut down all the trees. And again, this, I think, is a reference to when Revelation talks about, a third of the earth was burned up, a third of the land, a third of the trees were burned up, and then later it says a half of the trees were burned up, the grass was burned up. It's not talking about literal burned up, but it's definitely talking about this metaphor of how, the Rome engaged in a scorched earth policy. They didn't leave anything. They destroyed everybody, and they raped the land in order to engage in their sieges. So that was like, burning up the trees and the grass and stuff, So that's another example where that kind of hyperbolic language about, all this stuff happening can be reflected in the language as well of Josephus. But the sieges would take months sometimes, and sometimes they would starve them out, but sometimes they would just battering ram their way through the walls. The Romans were famous for their battering rams, and it's really interesting because early on before the actual war occurred, we're talking like 66 AD, I think it is. Cestius, Nero sent Cestius, a Syrian general, with several legions to go down to Jerusalem and take it. And what happens is he actually surrounds the city and he starts to break into the temple. And he's literally on the verge of breaking into the temple, in which case, if he did, it would all be over. Once you take the temple, the people submit, right? Mm-hmm. And he's literally on the verge of it. And for some reason, Josephus says, no one knows why, he just, all of a sudden, Cestius withdrew, pulled his army out, and ran away back to Syria. And on the way, the Jews thought that God had helped them. So they chased him down and killed most of the Roman soldiers. It was this strange occurrence that fueled the Jews thinking, God's on our side, we can defeat the Romans. And that was the first time that, so what I'm getting at is, historically, Josephus writes about this, Jerusalem was surrounded twice, once in AD 66, but then he left. And then about a year and a half later is when he came back, and then that was the war. Mm-hmm. And then the second time he surrounded the city, but here's what happens. Remember how we talked about how Jesus said, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, flee to the mountains. Well, think about this. If Rome is surrounding the city, how are you going to flee? They're going to catch you. You can't go through the Roman lines because sometimes they would build a wall. Sometimes they would have guards because they didn't want people to escape and get away, right? So how can you escape the city if it's being in the middle of a siege? Well, you can. There's two ways. So there's two times in the siege where it was possible for the Christians to leave. One was the first in AD 66 when Cestius was surrounding the city. All the Christians are in there going, oh, we should have left. All of a sudden he mysteriously leaves. And now that's when Josephus says some people left the city at that time. And I think that was included the Christians. And I think that's when they left, so that the second time when Rome came, they were already gone. There's one other place where more people could have left the city, and that is when Vespasian, we're already in the war here. We're talking like 68 AD. The Roman armies are coming down in Jerusalem, and they find out that Nero is dead. And what that means is Vespasian is going to what that means is the empire is now in chaos because there's all these different guys who are fighting to take over the throne because Nero did not have any progeny. So Rome went into a civil war for a year. And at that point, Vespasian withdrew and waited a year in the land of Israel. Vespasian went back to Rome to end up claiming the throne. That took a year. And Titus then took over. So during that year period, there was a time when all of a sudden Rome withdrew for a little bit, and then it went back and finally destroyed the city. So it's these fascinating possible places in history where the Christians could have left, and it could have been either of those times. And there were a lot of Jews who left too, because the innocent people wanted to leave as well. So those are two cases where that occurred.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about how amazing it is that Christians miss out on this, because there's a great danger when you misread the text of Scripture. The first danger is you miss out, you get the wrong message from the text, and the second danger is you miss the true message of the text. And I think this is largely much of a Western American thing, because we seem to have this whole hang-up on literalism. I mean, one of the things that always bugs me so much is when people ask me, do you take the Bible literally? As if it's an all or nothing game.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so true. Here's one of the things I like to tell Christians. I mean, if the author of the book tells you up front how to interpret it, then you follow his rule. And John in Revelation 1:1, he says, the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave to show his servants the things that must soon take place, he made it known by sending his angel to the servant John. The phrase made it known, he made it known in Greek, is the word for symbolism. He symbolized it to John. So this notion of, really taking, revelation, if you don't believe it literally, then you're a liberal. You are being liberal if you don't take Revelation highly symbolic. Now, again, as I said earlier, that doesn't mean that there isn't a mixture of some literal things in there, right? Like as you and I believe, the first couple chapters talk about John is writing to these 7 churches in Asia, and we don't believe that those are, or at least I know I don't believe that they are symbolic of the periods of history of the church. There are some people who do. Yeah. And by the way, I'm not against that, because you must be open to the possibility of symbolism on every level, right? Mm-hmm. But as a matter of fact, even though I think symbolism definitely dominates, there's still going to be times he's still writing to literal churches. These churches literally existed in Asia Minor, and they existed on a road, a postal road. So this wasn't just he's just writing to, he's writing to cities that he knows the letter's going to be taken to on the postal road, right? And so when he's talking to them, these incidents that he talks about, whether it's Philadelphia or Ephesus, these are real churches that have real problems in history going on right then at the time. But then part of his encouragement is, but guess what's going to happen, folks? Then he blends into the rest of Revelation, where he then talks about, I had this vision, and let me explain to you this vision, why you should persevere through your own little persecution, because all of it's going to come to an end when the temple is destroyed, right? And so the symbolism should be the dominant means of understanding Revelation, but that doesn't mean there aren't some aspects that are literal. It just means you have to be more rigorous and in your exegesis, rigorous in your attempt to explain things. It's not so easy. It's just not easy, But like, for instance, I think that there are cases, Revelation 11 talks about the 2 witnesses, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that there's a clear case where there could be a mixture of literal as well as symbolic, but the symbolism takes priority. So what I mean by that is, talks about go measure the temple of God and protect it. What's going on there? He's going to protect the inner temple, but the outer temple, he says, the outer temple is going to be given over to the nations, and they will trample the holy city for 42 months. And I will grant my authority to the 2 witnesses, right? Well, I think those 42 months was a literal 3.5 years that did occur. That was the 3.5 years of the war of the Romans trampling down the land of Israel and the holy city. It took him 3.5 years. So I think that's kind of literal, right? And he's trampling the holy city is a phrase that was, it was indicating ultimate destruction of the holy city. But then he says, it's the temple's given over to the nations. And we read this instantly with our modern notion of nations. Well, that's nations like China's a nation, right? But that's not what the word means. The word means like the Gentiles, the peoples. And when the Jew wrote about the peoples, he was always referring to those who are outside of Israel. And it wasn't nation states. It was just all kinds of peoples, right? And guess what? Roman Empire had conquered all the Gentile nations around. So the Roman Empire itself was like the nations. Mm-hmm. And so if Rome is besieging Jerusalem, it's like the nations are besieging Jerusalem and trampling the city, right? So you can see how the symbolism integrates really well with this historical on a symbolic as well as literal level. And this is why, for example, I think, like you read the two witnesses. And this is a really fascinating one. And Ken Gentry actually makes the suggestion that these witnesses might have been two literal people, but they might have also been a symbol of the Christian church that stayed. So maybe some Christians stayed in the city to announce the gospel. But whatever the case is, it clearly talks about two olive trees, and it says one has the power to shut the sky, no rain may fall. There's an obvious connection to Elijah, and then there's another connection to every plague, like Moses was able to have the plague. So these two witnesses sort of represent Elijah and Moses, and they're symbolically representing that. Why? What would be the point of that? Well, I think the point of that is it makes sense that they symbolically represent Elijah and Moses, and God could be saying, he's saying Israel is an unfaithful wife to me, right? Israel is like a harlot. I'm going to judge her, and I'm going to follow the law. What does the law say about an unfaithful, adulterous wife? Well, it says you must have two witnesses, number one, or you can't execute them. And then you can divorce a wife and execute them and marry a new bride. And so what I think is going on here is John is saying, look, the law and the prophets are the witnesses against Israel because they rejected the law and prophets by rejecting Messiah. So therefore, they are the legal judgment on Israel for being unfaithful to Yahweh. So Yahweh is going to execute her with capital punishment. Why? So that he can marry a new bride, the body of Christ. Because the unbelieving Jews were no longer acceptable to God, and God married the remnant of true believers. And so I think the picture of Revelation is, and this goes back to Gentry's argument, that the name of his Revelation commentary is The Divorce of Israel. Mm-hmm. I think Revelation is a divorce scroll, literally, against Israel, and he's claiming this is why you're guilty. He gives all the legal reasons, and then this is what I'm going to do to you. I'm going to engage in capital punishment and execute you. Why? Because you are the harlot, meaning you are unfaithful to Yahweh. And that's why I believe that the harlot in Revelation is the apostate Jewish leadership, religious leadership over Israel. And it's interesting because here's another example where you have imagery that people would admit, I acknowledge it's a symbol. It's a symbol. But what they do is they don't look into that symbol into the Old Testament. And if you do, you'll find that the phrase of harlot in the Old Testament is only used of Israel. Why? Because this is key. Israel is the only people who were covenanted to be the wife of Yahweh. So you see, you can't call a Gentile nation, whether it's Romans or some people think the harlot is Islam, whatever, it's like, or Roman Catholic Church. You can't. None of these nations or peoples were covenanted to Yahweh. Only Israel was covenanted to Yahweh to be his wife. So only Israel could be an unfaithful, adulterous wife called a harlot. And this is what I often point out to people. So when you're trying to figure out who is the harlot, who is it? Is it Islam? Is it this? Is it that? It has to be Israel because only Israel is referred to that. So when John writes about the great harlot, it's like, oh, okay, this is making this all these connections are making more sense.
Well, Ron, it's 4:55 here, so we sadly have to be wrapping things up here. The book is Resistant. It's book 3 in the series. The Kindle version, as of the time of this recording, is $6.75. The paperback is $19.79. And Brian, do you have a blog, a website, an email where people can get in touch if you want to find out more?
I do. Godawa.com, just my name, Godawa.com. You can find out all kinds of information. I have cool stuff, and I have free articles about Revelation and books that you can get. I have artwork and a lot of explanation of my work. I built it's a very informative but also an interesting website if you want to learn more about it. If you want to buy my stuff, everything's on Amazon. And Resistant, by the way, is now on audiobook as well. So everything's on. Every one of the books are ebook, paperback, and audio. And I would recommend you start with the first book of the series, Tyrant, Rise of the Beast, because it's a flow. The stories of these books aren't standalone. It really is a series. And you can start with Tyrant. And and so you can just get everything at Amazon, and more information would be Godawa.com.
And do you have any final messages you'd like to leave for Deeper Waters audience?
Well, no, just thank you. Thanks so much for the talk. Yours are among the most deep in terms of going deep into the meaning and stuff of things, which I really appreciate being able to do. So thanks for having me on.
Waters for a reason.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
That's why we call it Deeper Waters, Godawa. Right. What do you think?
Going deep. Well, I do hope we'll see you back here again, and I'm pretty sure we will when the final book in the series comes out.
You betcha. It'll probably be. I'm already deep into it, so this one's going to happen a lot quicker. This will happen probably before the end of the year. Definitely, I hope to have it out by November.
Well, I'd like to remind everyone that next week we're going to have Greg Kutsona on talking about his book Neuroscience and Christian Faith. For now, I'm Nick Peters, and I'm signing off.